Hi, we continue in Jesus' Jerusalem ministry with the central passage in the chiasm, and probably one of the most famous in the New Testament, the question of Caesar's coin, as it's often presented. Although we'll see that the question is only partly about the coin and partly about the surprising question of tribute, which is not in any of the translations I found in English, and yet that's the word that Luke uses here in the question they present to Jesus to try to trap him. So to get there, let's look at a few things that help us situate our context here. If you haven't watched the introductory video to Jesus' Jerusalem ministry, I encourage you to do that to see some of the things that we've been looking at to shape this section here. But as you can see on the right side of the screen, this section follows this set of stories, and we're now on this one here, alternating a little bit, as we've seen, between people challenging Jesus in an honor-shame sort of way, which is to say to put his reputation on the line in public before the people who are listening to him. Then Jesus telling this little parable allegory that we looked at in the last two videos, challenging them, and they get that it's about them. So now we see they send spies to trap him around this question, and the Sadducees will come again, and Jesus will turn it around on the scribes of the question there, and then go to the people, specifically about being aware of the scribes. So when we see this in the entire context of Luke's gospel, we see that what's at issue is the authority of the Jerusalem leadership in the face of their challenge to Jesus' authority. So when we see the chiasm that makes up the unit, we see all of it is about authority. And here the question is the authority of God versus the question of Caesar and empire, as we'll see, framed by the questions of the fate of Jerusalem, its leadership now, and the fate of authority in the life to come, symbolized by the question of marrying somebody in the afterlife. So that's the context for our story here. And as I've been showing in a number of passages, especially in the parable we saw last time, so many scholars intent upon digging into the story and not reading it on its own, but trying to separate the parable from the gospel and the words of Jesus from the parable, run up against walls of misinterpretation or no interpretation. Here, in this review, recently by Simeon Burke in 2018 of Biblical Research, he realizes in this situation that post-World War II research has resulted in what he says here. The last 70 years or so have witnessed commentators confidently asserting radically contradictory conclusions for both the reference and relationship of, quote, the things of Caesar, unquote, and the, quote, things of God, unquote. And what he shows in that is not a matter of methodology, but simply a matter of personal point of view. Because scholars now, just as the scribes then, have a lot at issue in whether the government is acceptable in the face of the religious claims of God and of Jesus as God's representatives. And as Burke points out in this article, so many of the earlier commentaries just assumed falsely that Jesus was, quote unquote, not political, but purely theological, so that he wouldn't care about taxes. But as Burke notes here, not only for this passage, but so many others, the advent of awareness after the Holocaust of how so much Christian biblical interpretation was implicitly or explicitly anti-Jewish, or that recent study around the world, around biblical studies and otherwise, in post-colonial views, and in my own area of empire critical stuff, has led people to be much more aware of how politics and religion were integrated. But it's been an uphill battle. So as Burke notes, one of the pioneers in this area, suggesting that Jesus was not only against paying taxes to Rome, but was perhaps leading a revolution, written by Brandon. Burke notes that Brandon was denigrated in ad hominem attacks as not a real scholar, or his work not serious, etc., although now it's come around a little more. So we're not going to look at scholarly views that really don't express methodology or any kind of scholarship, but really just the opinions of people who want the outcome one way or another. As we've been doing, we're going to look at it in its own context in Luke's Gospel, and we'll see that although there are obviously versions of the story in Mark and Matthew, Luke's has some very specific changes that makes Luke's message very different. So let's look at the story in synoptic comparison. Plainly, Luke has borrowed it from Mark, as Matthew has, and you can see here in what I've marked as bold is what's unique to each of them. So Luke frames his story, which forms a chiasm, which I'll show you in a minute, around this question of trying to trap him. And although there's the word trap here in Mark and the word trap in Matthew, it's a different word. So the word for trap here, which we'll look at the Greek when we look individually at the words, is the same word here in verse 20 and here in verse 26, and makes this into a little chiasm that the others are not. The other major change is the question of taxes in Mark and Matthew is with the word kenson, which is curiously also the word for census, and though Luke has a census, he doesn't use that word. So it can also mean something about registration of taxes, in the sense that the purpose of the census was to determine who lives where and who is subject to taxes. So those kinds of taxes are the ordinary taxes that we perhaps think of in the United States or in other Western democracies, where some of your income is taken and it's used to buy things that the government provides for people, whether that's roads, etc., or something else. But what we have in Luke is something very different, phoron, which is tribute. Tribute isn't used, or may be used to pay ordinary expenses, but that's not the point. Tribute is there to give honor to the emperor or to a general or something like that. So a specific tribute can be a whole ceremony that honors, say, a general who's won a war or battle, but can also be to honor the emperor. And it's often done nationally, not just individually, although individuals are required to pay it, but as a group for people who are not citizens. So this is certainly this kind of tax, the phoron or tribute, is designed to acknowledge the superiority of Caesar over any other claimant. And that's the specific meaning of phoron as opposed to kenson here. So scholars who look at this about the question of Caesar's got to pay his bills have missed the key point here of how Luke has changed it. Also, note that each of them has a different interior reason for why Jesus does what he does. In Mark, it says, knowing their hypocrisy. Matthew has out loud his hypocrisy, but aware of their malice. And here he has perceived their craftiness, using the word panorgia, as we'll see, which can also mean treachery. So Luke's Jesus is very aware that they're trying to trap him by sending people who are not obvious who they are. So we saw in Mark, they sent some Pharisees and Herodians, which, as Ched Myers has pointed out in his study of Mark, are not natural allies. Being opposed to Jesus makes them allies. Here in Matthew, it's the Pharisees. But as I noted in the introduction of this unit, the Pharisees are not in this section of Luke, because Luke has made the Pharisees a stand-in for his elite Roman young audience, who are preparing either to become part of the Roman Empire and make money and honor and status and power there, or to reject all that and side with Jesus and become part of the discipleship community. So that's what's at issue in Luke's version, very different here. So the spies who pretend to be honest, how they're pretending to be honest isn't exactly clear, other than the things they say, which are also said more or less over here, although slightly differently, in order to butter Jesus up, to honor him in a way that he often rejects, although he doesn't hear, as he does when they call him good teacher, and he says, why do you call me good? So that's the setup for our story here. And to help us understand it, let's look at a couple of other things that are unique to Luke. The language of money and coins is an important one. What we see here in the gray is buying, in the green is using money where there's a specific form of Roman currency at issue. So here denarii, here drachmas, etc. And the blue is where it's about money where there's no specific form of money given. So given that denarii are what's at issue here, show me a denarius, and it's the focus on it specifically, as we'll see in just a moment, it's worth looking at a couple other examples of that. We saw it in the story of the two debtors, where the issue was forgiving debts as part of the Jubilee theme in Luke, and it was 500 denarii versus 50. Notice that the story is told there with no concern for whose inscription or icon, as we'll see, the image, is on the coin. It's just told like using denarii is okay. And then we also see around denarii in the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan takes out 2 denarii and gives them to the innkeeper. Presumably, although he's a Samaritan, that he's coming down from Jerusalem temple, although when we looked at that passage, we noted there might be other reasons for Samaritans to be in the region. But again, there's no concern about the denarius being the problem. In fact, the fact that Luke mentions it, rather than speak generically about money or he gave them some money, highlights that there seemed to be nothing controversial about the denarius earlier. And in the story we saw of the nobleman who gives money, there it was nemas here and as pounds, not denarius. So when we have it here, it's the first time we're making denarius the focus of the story. So let's put up our synoptic comparison and we'll enter into our text here. So you can see below the chiasm, I'll put it on the screen here so you can see how it's framed around Jesus' perception. So their question and his answer have in the center that he's answering, understanding what they're about. So although they're pretending here, using the word related to hypocrite, but not exactly, hypokrinomenos here, only here in the New Testament, pretending here to be honest or righteous or just. I should back up and look at the spies word here, which is also only here in the New Testament. Notice in the story that's a synoptic trio here that Luke is using a number of words that are unique to shape it his own way. So they sent spies in order to trap him. And as I saw here, ebi lapontai here, which is used a couple of other times with different meanings. But the important thing is it frames the chiasm here. And also Luke has uniquely the purpose of this, and it's very much connected to the question, as we'll see. So they're trying to trap him to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. That's the first time we're hearing that as explicitly here. Let's look a little more closely. The word for jurisdiction, arche, is the word for, also means beginning, like the start of John's Gospel at arche en halogos. In the beginning was the word. It also means a ruler. So here, by implication, it refers to the scope of authority. So here's the word for authority, exousia, the one we see ordinarily. And note how that fits the chiasm here, highlighting it's around the authority of the governor, which is to say the authority of Caesar, making the question of authority central, as I said in the introductory video, to this whole unit. And here the governor, the hegemon, or hegemonos here, and only in 21:12, when in the apocalyptic discourse Jesus says, they will bring you before governors. So just as they're threatening to hand him over to the governor, we see, this will be exactly what they bring up in chapter 23, as we can see here. They began to accuse him, saying, we found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. Is that what he did, or is that not what he did? Well, whatever he did is enough to allow them to level that charge. Whether the charge is true or not is not determinate for whether they think that will get them before Pilate, but we can decide that when we get to chapter 23. So with this introduction, Luke has a very different setup for what's going on. There's no Pharisees, there's no Herodians. They're not trying to trap him for that purpose. It's the scribes and the chief priests who are trying to trap him to take the responsibility away from themselves and to give it to Pilate, which is to say they don't expect, understandably, that a religious argument, he's being blasphemous or he claims he's the Messiah, is something the Roman governor would be very concerned with. But ordering people not to pay tribute would be something that Pilate would have to deal with. Although in the event, we'll see, he doesn't, but we'll get there soon. So with that preface, let's look at what they ask here. And as my note below says, despite the fact that verse 20 tells us they are hypocrites, what they say here is the exact truth. So let's listen. So they call him teacher, and we've noted throughout, calling Jesus teacher is not a sign that they really get it. Lord would be a good one, or master, but teacher just says he's somebody out there with some teaching, and not necessarily that they defer to him. We know, and notice the little ABA chiasm, what they say here, that you are right, or orthos, as in orthodox, as in right that way. Not so much correct in the generic sense, but in the sense of the approved way in what you say and teach. And of course, they know that he's not. They know that what they're saying is not true. That you show deference to no one, literally, that you take no one's face, a figure of speech to say you don't look away from people, that you can look people in the face as a way of saying that you don't defer to authority. And certainly that's true. And teach the way of God in accordance with truth. And we've seen truth only one other time, aletheia in Luke, and we'll see it one other time. So this is all true. He's right in what he says. He shows deference to no one, and he teaches the way of God in accordance with truth, none of which they believe, although maybe they believe he shows no deference to their regret. They wishes they'd be deferent to the scribes and the Pharisees, but obviously he's not. So here comes the question. And we have to look in detail, because often bad interpretation founders on not reading carefully, as we've seen. Is it lawful? The word for lawful is existen, literally meaning is it possible? So it's not directly a legal question, as if somebody was going to arrest him for breaking the law. They're asking, is it possible, whether that's in the political or theological sense, as Judeans who submit to Yahweh, is this within the range of things for us to pay tribute to the emperor? And it's a perfectly good question. Here it's not asked as a good question. It's obviously asked to trap him publicly and have something with witnesses to bring before Pilate. But it's certainly a valid question that many would have asked. And here's the word for taxes, phoron, here, as tribute. As Green notes, an annual payment of 1 denarius per adult male and a, quote, perennial reminder and acknowledgement of Jewish subjugation to a foreign overlord. And that's, of course, the point about it being tribute. And he adds below, collected by the Sanhedrin, thus, quote, the question about the legality of paying tribute to the emperor is also a question about the authority of the Sanhedrin to serve as Rome's agents in Judea. Which highlights, as Green rightly notes, that that's what this whole section is about. In chapter 20 and 21, it's about the relative authority of the Sanhedrin in relation to Rome, in relation to God, in relation to Jesus. And all of these stories bring that out. To the emperor here, Caesar, first mentioned since 3:1, when the story of Jesus and John the Baptist in particular was put in the context of Emperor Tiberius. Here we see the center of the chiasm. He perceived their craftiness, panurgion, only here in the New Testament, but as the Lolita lexicon says, it can be translated as hypocrisy. But we hear this from Sirach, which uses it, and it's interesting. It's not clear that Luke has this in mind, but we know he uses the wisdom material that we see in this section here, so he may well have Sirach in mind. So let's listen to that. It's translated here in the NORSV as cleverness. There is a cleverness which is abominable, but there is a fool who merely lacks wisdom. Better is the God-fearing man who lacks intelligence than the highly prudent man who transgresses the law. There is a cleverness which is scrupulous but unjust, and there are people who distort kindness to gain a verdict. So notice these three verses form a little chiasm with panurgion in the beginning and the end, and noting that although it can be a good thing, it can be abominable because it's often an expression of not fearing God. And that's exactly what's at issue here. So whether Luke had that passage in Sirach in mind, it certainly is resonant with what's going on here. And Jesus' response is interesting. We may be so familiar with it, we don't notice how interesting it is. He not only doesn't answer their question, he draws closer attention to the material object that's at issue, not the generic abstraction of paying tribute, but to the particular object. So he says, show me, deiknomai here, 33 times in the New Testament, none in the Septuagint, and we've seen it a number of times in Luke. As Green notes further below, by requesting from them a denarius, then, Jesus exposes the nature of the question, since it is clear that they who possess denarii also possess their own answer. And that's part of the point that I'd like to make here is he doesn't seem to have one. They have one. It doesn't say they took one out. He says he has these question here, and they said the emperors. It doesn't say they ever took one out to show, but it's implied certainly that they do have one and that he does not. And then we realize that Jesus has never used coinage for money, and he's often deferred, especially in the feeding in the wilderness story, to inviting people to provide out of their own abundance and not use the abstraction of the imperial economic system at all. So the question here might not so much be about taxes as American citizens or other current citizens, if we're Christians, should we pay taxes, which is not even close to the question here, because these are not Christians, these are Jews under Roman imperial colonial authority. And so that's what's at issue here, and Jesus not having the coin goes beyond not participating in the Roman imperial reality. He refuses to participate in the money economy at all. And that echoes back to passages like Exodus 16 around the manna, which are behind the story of the feeding in the wilderness, where God provides and people should trust in God providing rather than the empire providing. And in the case of food, obviously for citizens, the empire did provide the anona, the grant in grain to those who were citizens. And you just come to the dock and show your citizenship and get one. So that's more what's at issue here than just citizens of a country being told to pay taxes or not based on their religion. So show me a denarius. Here's one from the time with Tiberius, and you can see both sides of it here with him seated and on the head, and that's exactly the icon they'd be talking about here. So the word isn't head here, the word is icona here, only here in the parallels in the Gospels, but 78 times in the Bible, and many of those in apocalyptic discourse, 14 times in Daniel 2 and 3, which isn't apocalyptic text in itself, the text about Nebuchadnezzar, and here it translates statue, the statue of the emperor there, 10 times in Revelation for the same kind of issue here. As Bavone notes here, the most common coins were those minted in Lyon over the course of a quarter century bearing the effigy of Tiberius, as you see here. So it's not so much the head as the icon, the image of the emperor, and the title here, the epigraphs here. And it's a question of whose, not what it says. The only other epigraph here will be the one over Jesus, which is exactly parallel in that sense, king of the Judaioi, as we'll see there. Caesar has his own head and title on the coin. Jesus will have his head and title on the cross, so to speak. And they say the emperors. And then he gives a wonderfully ambiguous answer, and it's the ambiguity of the answer that leads scholars to be all over the place, as Burke noted, confidently asserting radically contradictory things and really making themselves look foolish in claiming so strongly views that are the opposite and all across a range. So as Green notes below, and you note that I've relied on Green here because he's one of the only scholars in a commentary who seems to really get into some of the meat of the matter. Jesus asserts the prior and more fundamental claim of God on all human beings. But what does that actually mean? Let's listen to the ambiguous statement he makes here. Then give to the emperor, then here, only one other time, implies a mocking superiority. Give to the emperor, or as Green notes, better understood to give back, to return, or even to pay what one owes. So it's not a matter of giving like giving somebody something in need, but giving back what belongs to them. Literally, that's the coins, but is that all? Is he implying that you just shouldn't use the coins? Some scholars have suggested the issue is blasphemy, and we certainly know in the centuries of Christian formation under Greek philosophical people like Origen and others, Christians were forbidden from entering into the army, not because it was in the military and it was violent and it killed people, but because they had banners that celebrated the emperor, and that was deemed to be blasphemous. So is that the issue here, that it's blasphemous because it's got the emperor's coin as if he's a god, or emperor's head as if he's a god on it? Or is it what it represents, bigger, the tribute, which is to acknowledge that the gods have given authority to Rome, both of which plainly Jesus would not accept at all. And in fact, we saw in Luke's gospel at the beginning that the devil claims that all the authority of the world has been given from him. And it doesn't say explicitly in our story here that Rome's authority is from God, from the devil, excuse me, but that's certainly an implication one can draw from that story in Luke 4. And yet the answer does not lead to their response. What we hear is simply this: they were not able, in the presence of the people, the very people who they would need as witnesses, to trap him. In other words, he's given an ambiguous answer that does not give him the ability to call upon witnesses, go, we told you he was forbidden people from paying tribute, and these people will testify to it. The phrase for the in presence of, enatian talau here, underscoring the attempt to dishonor him precisely before the authorities fear, is what we saw earlier. And they're amazed by his answer. And we have to look at the language of amazement here in Luke. And it's here around a number of words here. But as you can see from this use down here, the word is thaumazo here, and so we can look at other uses of thaumazo and see how much amazement expresses people hitting a hard stop when something happens. So we're wondering about Zechariah's delay in the sanctuary. We saw that there. Amazed also at Zechariah writing that his name is John, and after he had been struck mute rather. Here amazed at the message of the shepherds about the heavenly host of angels. Here, amazed at the young Jesus, at his understanding, although that's a different word there. It's the parents who are amazed here with the same word. Here, just before they want to throw him over the cliff, the crowd in Nazareth amazed at the gracious words from his mouth. Then we see it here in that Jesus was amazed at the faith of the centurion that we saw there. The disciples are amazed and afraid at the same time at the lack of faith when they're on the water in the boat with him. And then we have this one here. Well, everyone was amazed in general at all that he was doing, and we see it more here. I won't go through all of them because you get the idea, although that's the penultimate one before we get to one here. And we see at the end that Peter's amazed at the empty tomb, and the people will be amazed at the resurrection. So here, these are big stories that they're amazed at. A tomb where they expect a dead body that's now empty, and a person they thought was dead who's alive and ask them for something to eat. So this is a very strong word here. It's not just puzzlement. It's people being stopped dead in the face of the answer. They thought, of course, that if he said the emperors, then the people would turn against him and his revolution would end. And if he said gods, then he'd be in trouble with Rome, and anybody who's loyal to Rome would turn against him. But with the ambiguous answer, they're not able to trap him, and they become silent, like Zechariah was at the beginning. And so the scribes and the Pharisees are done, but we'll see next time the Sadducees appear for the first and only time to try to trap him with a question about authority in the future. We'll see that next time. Bye-bye.